19-year-old Karmelo Anthony sentenced to 35 years in prison for fatally stabbing 17-year-old Austin Metcalf at a track meet. Metcalf's father delivering an emotional
35 years. That was the number read aloud inside a Collin County courtroom on June 9, 2026. 35 years in a Texas state prison for Karmelo Anthony, the teenager convicted of murdering 17-year-old Austin Metcalf during a high school track meet in Frisco, Texas. The jury had spoken. The judge accepted their decision. For a brief moment, it seemed one of the most controversial criminal cases in recent Texas history had finally reached its conclusion. But outside that courthouse, a very different scene was unfolding. Supporters from both sides had gathered throughout the day. Some demanded justice for Austin Metcalf. Others argued Karmelo Anthony acted in self-defense. As word of the sentence spread, tensions grew. Arguments broke out. Police stepped in multiple times as emotions boiled over. By the end of the day, the atmosphere outside the courthouse had become almost as significant as the sentence itself. But before we talk about the clashes, before we talk about the protests, and before we talk about what 35 years actually means for Karmelo Anthony, we need to go back. Because this story did not begin inside a courtroom. It began on a rainy morning at a high school track meet, and it involved two teenage boys who had never met before. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old. Friends described him as hardworking, competitive, and focused on his future. He attended Memorial High School in Frisco, Texas, where he participated in athletics and maintained a strong academic record. Perhaps the most heartbreaking detail was that Austin had a twin brother named Hunter. The two were extremely close. They attended school together, trained together, and competed together. On the day Austin died, Hunter was only a few feet away. Karmelo Anthony was also 17 years old. He attended Centennial High School, another Frisco school competing at the same district championship meet. Family members described him as a talented athlete with college opportunities ahead of him. Like Austin, he appeared to have a bright future. The two teenagers came from different schools, different social circles, and different backgrounds. There was no known history between them, no previous argument, no rivalry, no reason to believe their paths would ever cross in a meaningful way. Then the weather changed. A rainstorm moved into the area during the district track championship at Kuykendall Stadium. Athletes, coaches, and students scrambled for cover as rain began pouring down. Team tents quickly filled with competitors trying to stay dry. According to testimony later presented in court, Karmelo Anthony ended up beneath a tent belonging to Memorial High School, Austin Metcalf's school. What happened next would become the central focus of a murder trial watched across the country. Witnesses testified that Austin and several others asked Anthony to leave the tent. Some witnesses said he was asked multiple times. What everyone agreed on was that a confrontation developed. It was not about sports. It was not about race. It was not about some long-running feud. It was an argument over space under a tent during a rainstorm. At first, it seemed like the kind of disagreement that happens every day among teenagers. Words were exchanged, voices rose, students nearby began paying attention. Then, according to multiple witnesses, Anthony allegedly issued a warning. Several students later testified they heard words similar to, "touch me and see what happens." Prosecutors would later argue those words became one of the most important details in the entire case. Moments later, physical contact occurred. Exactly how forceful that contact was became one of the biggest points of disagreement during the trial. Some described it as a shove. Others characterized it differently. The defense would later argue Anthony felt threatened and feared for his safety. Prosecutors argued what happened next went far beyond any reasonable response. The entire encounter unfolded in seconds. Austin Metcalf was stabbed in the chest. Panic spread immediately. Students screamed. Coaches rushed toward the scene. Emergency responders worked desperately to save him. Witnesses later described chaotic efforts to stop the bleeding while others stood frozen in shock. Hunter Metcalf was there. Austin's twin brother watched the nightmare unfold in real time. Despite efforts to save him, Austin died from his injuries. He was 17 years old. Meanwhile, Karmelo Anthony was taken into custody. According to testimony presented during trial, Anthony admitted he had stabbed Austin. The legal battle that followed would not focus on whether the stabbing occurred. Instead, it would focus on why it occurred. Was it murder or was it self-defense? That question would eventually divide families, communities, legal experts, activists, and millions of people online. Within hours of the incident, the story began spreading far beyond Frisco. Local news stations picked it up first, then national outlets followed. Social media amplified every new development. Before long, people who had never stepped foot in Frisco, Texas, were debating the case as if they had witnessed it themselves. The fact that Austin was white and Karmelo was black quickly became part of the national conversation. Supporters on both sides accused the other of spreading misinformation. Fundraisers appeared online. Commentators weighed in. Arguments exploded across social media platforms. What started as a deadly encounter between two teenagers became something much larger. As weeks turned into months, the case continued attracting attention. The families found themselves at the center of a national debate. Public opinion began forming long before a jury was ever selected. Some believed the evidence pointed clearly toward murder. Others insisted the case was a straightforward example of self-defense. The louder the conversation became, the harder it became to separate facts from opinions. For more than a year, the case remained in the spotlight. Then, in June of 2026, the trial finally began. Prosecutors prepared to present eyewitness testimony from students who had been standing only feet away from the confrontation. Defense attorneys prepared to argue that Karmelo Anthony feared for his safety and reacted in the heat of the moment. Both families entered the courtroom knowing their lives would never be the same, and as jurors took their seats and prepared to hear the evidence, the question that had divided the public for more than 14 months was finally about to be answered inside a courtroom rather than online. For 14 months, the case remained under a microscope. Every new development became a headline. Every court filing sparked debate. By the time jury selection began in June of 2026, this was no longer just a local criminal case. It had become one of the most closely watched trials in Texas. Even before opening statements, controversy emerged. The jury selection process immediately drew attention after the final panel contained no black jurors. Defense attorneys challenged several prosecution strikes, arguing that black prospective jurors had been removed unfairly. Prosecutors denied any racial motivation and argued their decisions were based on legitimate legal reasons. The judge ultimately allowed the jury to stand. But the issue would continue generating debate long after the verdict was announced. Once testimony began, prosecutors focused on establishing a straightforward narrative. They argued this was not a complicated self-defense case. According to their version of events, Karmelo Anthony was asked repeatedly to leave a tent that did not belong to him. Instead of leaving, prosecutors argued he escalated the confrontation. They pointed to witness testimony describing Anthony's alleged statement, "Touch me and see what happens," as evidence that he was prepared for a physical confrontation before any contact occurred. Then came the eyewitnesses. One after another, students who had been present at the track meet took the stand. Some had been only a few feet away when the argument unfolded. Others witnessed portions of the confrontation from nearby positions. While individual details sometimes varied, prosecutors emphasized that many of the accounts were remarkably similar regarding the key events. Witnesses consistently described a verbal confrontation, a brief physical encounter, and then the stabbing. The prosecution repeatedly returned to one central argument. Even if Austin Metcalf pushed Karmelo Anthony, they argued, a shove did not justify pulling out a knife and stabbing someone in the chest. Prosecutors told jurors that self-defense has limits under Texas law and that Anthony's response crossed those limits. The defense saw the situation very differently. Defense attorneys argued the confrontation could not be viewed in isolation. They told jurors that Anthony found himself surrounded by multiple students during a heated confrontation. According to the defense, the teenager felt threatened and believed the situation could quickly become dangerous. They argued that events unfolded within seconds and that Anthony reacted out of fear rather than intent to kill. Throughout the trial, defense attorneys attempted to humanize their client. They reminded jurors that Anthony was only 17 years old at the time of the incident. They highlighted his lack of a serious criminal history and pointed to his athletic achievements and future opportunities. Their argument was not that Austin Metcalf deserved what happened. Instead, they argued that Anthony made a terrible decision in a frightening moment rather than committing an intentional murder. As testimony continued, emotions inside the courtroom remained intense. Austin's family sat through every detail of the final moments of his life. His father listened as witnesses described the confrontation. His mother listened as medical testimony explained the fatal injury. Hunter Metcalf, Austin's twin brother, faced the painful reality of hearing strangers discuss one of the worst moments of his life. Meanwhile, Karmelo Anthony's family watched as prosecutors portrayed their son as a murderer. They listened as witness after witness described events that could determine whether he would spend decades behind bars. Outside the courtroom, the case continued fueling fierce debate. Supporters of Anthony organized demonstrations. Some argued that racial bias had influenced public perception of the case from the beginning. Others pointed to the composition of the jury and questioned whether Anthony could receive a truly fair trial under the circumstances. On the other side, supporters of the Metcalf family argued the facts were clear. They pointed to eyewitness testimony and emphasized that Austin Metcalf had lost his life during what should have been an ordinary school event. As the trial moved forward, social media became increasingly hostile. False information circulated online. Rumors spread rapidly. Both families reported harassment and threats. What began as a criminal case had evolved into a national argument that neither family could control. Inside the courtroom, however, jurors were instructed to focus only on evidence. One of the most important moments came when prosecutors presented the sequence of events leading up to the stabbing. They argued that Anthony had multiple opportunities to walk away from the confrontation. According to prosecutors, every opportunity to de-escalate was ignored. They maintained that the fatal encounter could have been avoided entirely if different choices had been made. The defense countered by emphasizing the speed of the incident. They argued that jurors should place themselves in the position of a teenager facing a rapidly escalating confrontation. Fear, confusion, and adrenaline, they argued, can influence decisions in ways that appear irrational afterward. As closing arguments approached, both sides understood the stakes. Prosecutors asked jurors to focus on accountability. They argued that Austin Metcalf lost his life over a confrontation that never should have reached that point. They reminded jurors that the victim would never return home and that the evidence supported a murder conviction. Defense attorneys urged jurors to consider whether prosecutors had truly disproven self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. They argued that uncertainty remained regarding Anthony's state of mind and what he believed in those final seconds before the stabbing. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and emotional testimony from witnesses and family members, the case was handed to the jury. The public expected lengthy deliberations. Many legal observers predicted jurors would spend days reviewing evidence. Instead, what happened next shocked nearly everyone following the case. The jury reached a decision far faster than most people expected. And when the courtroom reconvened, both families prepared to hear a verdict that would change their lives forever. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. For a case that had consumed national headlines for more than a year, many observers expected days of discussion. Instead, the decision came quickly. When court officials announced that a verdict had been reached, family members, reporters, and spectators rushed back into the courtroom. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Guilty. The jury found Karmelo Anthony guilty of murder. The courtroom immediately filled with emotion. Members of both families reacted as the reality of the verdict settled in. For the Metcalf family, it marked the end of a long and painful legal battle. For the Anthony family, it marked the beginning of an entirely different struggle. But the case was not over. The jury still had to determine punishment. Under Texas law, Anthony faced a wide range of possible sentences. The stakes were enormous. His future now depended on how jurors viewed not only the crime itself, but also the circumstances surrounding it. During the sentencing phase, both sides presented arguments aimed at influencing the jury's decision. The defense asked jurors to consider Anthony's age. They reminded the jury that he had been 17 years old at the time of the incident. Family members described him as a young man who had made a catastrophic mistake rather than a lifelong criminal. His mother took the stand and pleaded for mercy, telling jurors that despite everything that had happened, he was still her son. The prosecution focused on Austin Metcalf. They reminded jurors that Austin would never graduate college, start a family, or pursue the future he had planned for himself. They argued that while Anthony still had opportunities ahead of him, Austin's opportunities ended forever on that rainy day at the track meet. Then came the victim impact statements. These moments are often among the most emotional parts of any criminal trial, and this case was no exception. Members of Austin's family addressed the courtroom directly. They spoke about loss, they spoke about grief, they spoke about the empty space left behind by a 17-year-old boy whose life ended in seconds. For Hunter Metcalf, the pain was especially profound. Losing a sibling is devastating under any circumstance. Losing a twin is something many people struggle to comprehend. Throughout the proceedings, the bond between the brothers remained a central part of the story. The defense also attempted one final argument. They asked jurors to consider whether Anthony acted under what Texas law describes as sudden passion. If accepted, that finding could significantly reduce the punishment range. The argument centered on the idea that emotions and fear overwhelmed Anthony during the confrontation. Jurors rejected it. Just as they had during the guilt phase, the jury reached its decision relatively quickly. Then came the number that would dominate headlines across the country: 35 years. Karmelo Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in prison. At 19 years old, he now faced the possibility of spending much of his adult life behind bars. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Reports described Anthony becoming visibly emotional as the sentence was announced. Family members on both sides struggled to contain their reactions. Outside the courthouse, tensions exploded. Supporters gathered as news of the sentence spread through the crowd. Some believed justice had finally been served. Others believed the punishment was excessive and reflected deeper problems within the legal system. Arguments quickly broke out. Video from the scene showed heated exchanges between opposing groups. Demonstrators shouted over one another. Police officers moved into position as tempers flared. Several confrontations nearly turned physical. For law enforcement, the challenge was keeping emotions from boiling over into violence. The clashes outside the courthouse reflected a division that had existed since the earliest days of the case. For some people, the verdict represented accountability. They pointed to the eyewitness testimony, the physical evidence, and the jury's decision. To them, the legal system had worked exactly as intended. Others viewed the outcome differently. They questioned the jury selection process. They pointed to the absence of black jurors on the final panel. They argued that issues surrounding race and public perception could not simply be ignored. For them, the sentence became part of a much larger conversation about fairness and justice in America. Neither side appeared willing to back down. Even after the trial ended, public debate continued online, on television, and across social media. Meanwhile, the legal process moved into its next phase. Anthony's attorneys quickly signaled their intention to appeal. Appeals are not new trials. They do not ask whether a defendant is guilty or innocent. Instead, appellate courts examine whether legal errors occurred during the original proceedings. In this case, many legal analysts immediately focused on jury selection issues as one possible area of review. Whether those arguments will succeed remains uncertain. Appeals can take years. Some convictions are overturned. Most are not. For now, the guilty verdict remains in place. As that process unfolds, both families continue living with consequences that no court ruling can erase. For the Metcalf family, no sentence can bring Austin back. No appeal can undo what happened at that track meet. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering will carry the absence of someone who should still be there. For the Anthony family, the future now revolves around prison visits, appeals, and the reality that a teenager they raised is beginning a sentence measured not in months but in decades. And that may be the hardest part of this entire story. Two families entered April of 2025 expecting ordinary lives. One rainy morning changed everything. A confrontation lasting only moments ended one life and permanently altered another. Today, Austin Metcalf is gone. Karmelo Anthony is serving a 35-year prison sentence. The appeals process is just beginning. The public debate continues. And the questions surrounding justice, accountability, self-defense, and fairness remain as divisive as ever. More than a year after a disagreement under a track meet tent turned deadly, people are still arguing about what happened, why it happened, and whether the outcome was fair. But regardless of where anyone stands, one fact remains impossible to dispute. Two families were forever changed by a decision that took only seconds to make. If you have thoughts on the verdict, the sentence, or the issues raised throughout this case, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy in-depth investigative documentaries that go beyond the headlines, be sure to subscribe for more stories like this.